Greetings, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series for the 7th of June 2023. Today's session, we have two speakers with us today, but first we'll have an introduction. This session is about authentic and online assessment in an AI-enabled world, so that's kind of like the theme. Fabio, would you like to do the introduction for AHE, please?
Certainly.
Hi, Fabio, away you go.
There we are. Thank you so much, Mathew, for introducing us and for having us. This is a joint section with the Assessment in Higher Education Network. This has been an ongoing and very productive collaboration amongst the two networks. I'm really pleased to be together once again with Mathew and with you all. We got two conference committee members from the Assessment in Higher Education Network today. There is myself, I'm going to be chairing the session, and we also have Dr. James Wood, who's a new member of the committee, and we welcome him. He's based also here in the UK at the University of Bangor, and he's going to help me up filtering questions and supporting the session. So let me tell you a little bit about the AHE network. We are an independent network, and we focus on anything that relates to research-informed practice in assessment and feedback in higher education. We organized our operation through an international executive committee, which is physically based at the University of Cumbria in England, but members are from all parts of the world, really. And we are really interested in all range of practices. Those can be subject-based, professional-based, theory, applications, anything that pertains to assessment and feedback. And you're most welcome to have a look at our website, ahenetwork.org. Can I please ask colleagues to mute their microphone? I can hear some feedback. Thank you very much. So I was saying we have a conference every year, generally in June, and this year is going to take place between the 22nd and the 23rd of June in Manchester, England, at the McDonald Hotel. And I know that we are close to the bone, but if you are interested to join us, please visit our website, or at least make a note for the next conference, and we welcome submissions from colleagues as well. And for any question, please feel free to reach out to any of us. You can find our contacts at the website or to James and I personally. But without further ado, I would like to introduce the two speakers of today. We are going to have Dr. Chahna Gonsalves from King's College London and Professor Margaret Bearman at Deakin University in Australia. We are going to have the two presentations one by one. Each presentation should take between 15 and 20 minutes. So we will see if there are any urgent questions, clarification questions, but we very much generally have discussion at the very end of the session altogether. So please, let me introduce the first speaker, Chahna Gonsalves. Welcome with us, and please, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Mathew and James also for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am going to give you what I'd like to think of as a little bit of a case study of my use of Chat-GPT, and hopefully potentially raise some questions about how we can continue to develop more authentic assessment, particularly with the use of multiple choice. So for a little bit of context, I'm a lecturer in marketing education at King's. I've been teaching particularly the principles of marketing module now for 3 years at King's, and that is core across 3 degrees. So for the last 3 years, I've had approximately 600 students on that module. And I also teach level 5 brand management, which also both courses use MCQ. So in November, I was preparing the assessments for term 2, so January to May. In these courses, they both have a summative MCQ component. So on my level 5 brand management, there are 2 in-class tests that are about 15%. They're worth 15% each, and they take place about 4 weeks apart. Those were based on core reading, as you might expect. So just to ensure that students were keeping up with the chapters from the textbook, but also that they had the concepts to apply to their coursework, which was worth the remaining 70%. And I was the sole person leading that module, leading tutorials, and also, of course, marking assessment. Now, for the level 4 principles of marketing, as I said, we had 600 students. I was co-teaching that module with a colleague. And for that, we had an MCQ test, which was worth 40% of the module grade. It was endpoint assessment for that one. And that exam took place in June. So one of the other things that I needed to think about here was the timeline of these assessments, as the first in-class test for brand management would take place in February, the second in March, and then we'd have to wait until June for the 40% multiple choice on principles of marketing. Now, all of these went to our external examiners, and I'm saying that because I know we have a lot of Australian colleagues here, and I understand that you don't all have to go through that process of passing assessment in advance to external examiners, but that meant that the questions had to be set and they needed to hold up in light of Chat-GPT. Now, also in November, when I was preparing these, Chat-GPT was launched on the 30th of November. And I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with Chat-GPT by now. So just in case anybody isn't, very briefly, you can use Chat-GPT as a large language model, also as a chatbot. You can input a question or a prompt and it will respond with a consolidated response. So I was pretty aware that many of my students were very excited about Chat-GPT when it was launched, and they were quite open about the fact that they wanted to use it and they were going to use it. Some of those who were perhaps intending to use it in the way that I wouldn't necessarily like were discussing in class about how they would be helping each other to use it so that they didn't have to study, particularly for my second year brand management exam. And I walked into the room as they were having this discussion. So I knew that I had to ensure that these assessments were robust enough to hold up with them using this. Now, of course, with multiple choice, we use multiple choice quite a lot on large modules, and I know that many of us are moving away from it, but I just wanted to highlight some of the considerations around MCQ. We generally get a lot of the questions from textbook text banks, where the publishers have made it very easy for us to use these questions, often as templates, just for adaptation and then to implement into our tests. Generating MCQ questions does take a lot of time, and the manual generation of the questions is actually still the most common form, because we as experts understand where students are likely to misunderstand concepts, where they're likely to misinterpret, and therefore it can be quite useful for us to use those opportunities to generate questions with likely but incorrect responses. Now, because I use so many MCQs in my modules, I've spoken with a number of the publishers, and it's often the textbook's authors who have prepared these questions. But what happens then is that the textbooks have one set of questions that become quite dated, and they're available on the internet. They're available for us on the internet, usually locked behind instructor access, but then they end up being circulated on the internet by students, by GTAs who also want to generate assessment for their first modules, and then they become shared quite easily. So actually, because of this wide access, these questions are not very protected. A couple of the things that I wanted to think about was, realistically, that King's was not going to allow me to go to an invigilated in-class test or an invigilated end-of-year exam for principles of marketing. So I had to make multiple choice work. Also, as I said, because I was teaching either by myself or with one other person, the amount of marking that this would have introduced at the last minute was quite a consideration, given that we didn't have those spare resources to reallocate to modules at that point. Everybody's time had been allocated elsewhere. So I wanted to really draw on the principles and I guess the practices that we had during COVID, where we were forced to be creative about things. And I found that we were moving away from that a little bit, but this was an opportunity for me to attempt to do that on principles of marketing and brand management. So how creative could I be? The final thing was somebody said to me, like, why don't you just try to generate the questions based on the text? So using text analysis in order to generate some new questions. And my problem with that is that if the text is available for me to plug into any of these models, it means it's probably available on the internet. So I needed to generate more original questions to avoid that. Looking into some of the best practice guidance for MCQs, the guidance tends to be quite repetitive of how to design a question. In the top right hand corner of the slide, you'll see the basic components of an MCQ question, and I'd like to just draw your attention to the fact that I'm going to use the word STEM to refer to the actual question that we ask. But in addition to the STEM, you have a number of distractors. These are the response options, and the correct one is described as the key. Now, when you look at a lot of multiple choice guidance, you get quite generic advice about the length of the questions, which should be short and not contain any superfluous information. We shouldn't window dress, as this describes, so not just providing lots of text that doesn't actually have relevance to the questions. We should try to use questions that ask the students to identify the correct response and not using double negatives, for example. All of the distractors should be plausible, so likely answers, but three or so of them are incorrect. And there's a lot of research about how many distractors we should have. So the typical number of distractors for multiple choice is 2 to 4 responses, and that can vary. And there's a lot of research that suggests actually 3 is the optimal number, but most of us go for 4. Now, I also went for 4 because that's what my students were accustomed to, and I also had to create extra practice tests which had 4 responses, so I wanted a little bit of continuity. Now, what that meant was that while I was looking into the literature about how to design these questions, there wasn't actually very much for me to work with, and some of the guidance is actually very helpful, but it leads us to write questions that we're quite familiar with, I think. So the guidance to help us design more creative questions that prompt students to apply their knowledge and to reach higher levels of higher order thinking is to map our questions against Bloom's taxonomy. And I'm going to assume that we're all pretty familiar with Bloom's taxonomy by now, but I found this particular visual quite helpful. If anybody wants to write multiple choice questions, I found having the extended version of Bloom's quite helpful in terms of giving me ideas to write a range of questions. So that was really why I wanted to show this version of Bloom's taxonomy. How could we integrate prompts that require the students to analyze and synthesize information and also evaluate in the context of multiple choice? Now, this was going to be hard. For me, I had my in-class tests, which were limited to 18 minutes with 18 questions. And for my end of term multiple choice test on principles of marketing, that would be 60 minutes and 60 questions. So I had different time allowances to play with. And actually that allowed me to do quite a lot with these different prompts. So this is where I'm going to speed up. The Chat-GPT, I think somebody is, okay. With Chat-GPT, the responses are faster because Chat-GPT consolidates its response. So unlike searching on Google, we don't have to go through a range of responses. The other types of value that it provides are that Chat-GPT can also explain the rationale behind the responses that it gives. So in terms of helping the students, this is quite unique. None of the other search engine options would provide that. And also it draws on sources like SparkNotes, CheckNotes. These are student study websites that provide questions and answers and have been available on the internet for many years. So where ChatGPT was trained on text on the internet up until 2021, a lot of the content, concepts, and textbook chapters that we use are available and you have been used in the train model, meaning that ChatGPT had a lot of potential to get the correct answers. There were 2 key studies where ChatGPT scored 63.6% on a microeconomics test, microeconomics test, and 83% on a macroeconomics test. So essentially aced the test of understanding in economics. And it had also, there are a number of papers where ChatGPT has scored sort of 60% or higher in medical licensing exams, therefore performing at the level of a third-year student. So these were my worries. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of the questions I used here. So a basic knowledge question. This was a question using the iPhone. The tips here were that because ChatGPT can use a matching format to pick out concepts that are conveyed in the stem of the question and match those to the answer, the tip was not to give clues to the concept in the stem. So using images was an opportunity to avoid essentially telling the student what concept this question relates to, and therefore allow them to really think about the application and apply that to the answer. Now, also in this image, hopefully you can see it large enough, but this question gives the prices of various iPhones, and it also gives an overview of the different positioning of these different versions of the iPhone, which meant that the student also really had to think about what the correct answer to this question was. Another example of application, this was a question that asked students which level of Maslow's hierarchy they would be meeting if they learned a language for leisure use. And I wanted to use a couple of apps that they were familiar with. Now I'm just going to say that I can see some questions coming up in the chat and I am going to answer those. I think excellent questions. Thank you. So something that I wanted to highlight in this question is that actually ChatGPT gives 2 correct answers, which meant that the students still had to evaluate those answers in order to pick out the correct response. So we are pushing to higher levels of higher order thinking. I used a question based on the World Cup. And so there was quite a lot of controversy around the FIFA logo, and that information was not on the internet at the time that the first in-class test happened. Now, this question, it's quite a lot of text on the slides. I'm not expecting you to read it. This question required the students to apply a model of 6 characteristics of effective logos, essentially, that they'd learned in the textbook to this logo to see what was wrong with it. And there were 2 things wrong with it. Now, again, ChatGPT gave 2 correct answers. And in particular, the students emailed me saying that they really liked these questions and they thought they were very engaging, they enjoyed the test, but they also felt that they did have to think about the correct answers quite hard, and they thought that the test was quite difficult. So this question, again, there's a lot of text here. This was requiring the students to evaluate different options in order to identify the correct answers based on a very popular chocolate brand, premium chocolate store. And then I think there were 2 more types of questions that I found I couldn't quite convey these on slides very well, but I wanted to give you an indication of other types that we were using. So we gave questions based on images where the students had to either respond to a question based on a particular part of the image, or they had to identify a part of the image to identify the correct answer. So images and hotspot questions were another way that we could ask the students questions which didn't convey all of the concepts in text, but allowed them to engage with the images in the assessment. And we also used scenario questions. Now, in the Principles of Marketing exam, we used an example of Patagonia where we were talking about Patagonia and sustainability. So based on answering one question in relation to one video, the student was then led to a second part of the video where they were asked a second question. I've also given an example on the slide because I know this is very popular in medicine, and I wanted to draw on what we know from medicine to design these questions. And I think there are a lot of opportunities here, particularly for management and marketing and in business schools, but certainly in other disciplines as well. So that brings me to the end of the questions, and just 2 slides of the results. We had an overall mean in Principles of Marketing there were 2 slightly different cohorts. So the smaller cohort of 143 students were students from the non-business degrees, non-business faculties. The mean result for them was 60%. The standard deviation was 14. So overall, there was quite a good distribution for the first attempt at this. And you can see that there were very few failures, but also the number of distinctions, probably what you'd expect. Now, for business students, where we had 473, that mean was a bit higher, and the standard deviation was 11%. So there was less variation, but overall still quite a good result. Now, again, some of the students wrote emails to say that they really enjoyed the exam. This one spotted a question which related to InPost, which is a Polish, where the CEO is Polish and she's also a Polish student. So they engaged with the questions in ways that we also didn't expect, and appreciated the overall exam. Now, for second year brand management, this was particularly interesting. The second year students admitted to me that they didn't want to read, they were not studying. I really had to force them to track, and to do that I used some of the similar questions in the lectures in class to sort of measure learning as we go. And I found this especially a struggle. I think this was probably sort of symptomatic of some of the bigger disengagement problems that we're experiencing, but overall the results to these 18 minutes tests were reasonable. And I think with this one, timing became a bit of an issue. So I had to, particularly in the second test, I had to organize all of the shorter questions in chunks at the beginning, so that the chunks of 4 questions got progressively slightly longer and also slightly more difficult. That meant that when questions were randomized within each section, no student would see the hardest questions at the beginning of the test. And that was a mistake that I made in the first test, which I think was a really important lesson to take away. The students really enjoyed the cases. And so my final slide, which I hope answers some of the questions that many of you are raising in the chat. And actually, I think this is quite reassuring for me that yes, I've considered a few important things, and I think I can also see some things that sort of prompt me to think about a few others also. But accessibility and inclusion. Now, because I knew that I would be conveying a lot of information in images and in video, I did a full assessment with my professional support team to make sure that students who had personal assessment arrangements or particular requirements would be able to engage with this test. They were either given extra time, or I had prepared for the option that some of those students would need this to be conveyed in text or by screen readers. Actually, we didn't have any of those, but I think just thinking about that in advance is a way to overcome that hurdle. Now, we're usually test banking, so having a few extra questions that are appropriate for those students would be the way that I would solve that problem. I was a bit concerned about the cognitive load that the number of images and the different methods of engagement would induce on the student. And as a result of that, I think it's important to have a number of one-line questions and very short and simple questions that you include in the test so that the cognitive load overall is balanced. Now, this led me to questions of timing. I wasn't, there was only one paper that I could find that really reviewed and questioned whether we do need to give students 1 minute per question in the test. We've come to accept this as common knowledge, but I don't think that is necessarily the case. And I think in terms of discrimination or discriminability of the questions in the test, I think it is sometimes worth having some harder questions which might take them slightly longer than 1 minute, as long as we're not being unfair in terms of the time distribution overall. I think it can be quite valuable to do that. Indicating that students should select different numbers of responses is also quite valuable, so they don't all have to be questions where they select only one. And I'm also familiar with a colleague of mine at King's is doing some research on whether we do actually need to tell students how many questions to select, or whether having them work out that they can only select 2 or 3 should be a valuable part of the test. Does that inspire any other types of thinking? Now, I think this is quite controversial and the research is in the early stages, but I will encourage him to share those findings when he gets to the end of that. But finally, I'd like to say that I do think a lot of value remains for using multiple choice in formative assessment. I know it's hard work and it does take time to prepare, but I think as we move to more online learning, more blended formats, I think it's really important for us to think about how we can design those questions in ways that encourage learning, so that we can continue to use them. I think they're especially valuable for students in terms of self-assessment and how we can use those to more authentically replicate the types of case studies that we teach, and the types of critical thinking and problem solving that students will be required to use upon graduation, I think is where we need to be moving. Now, my final question is, should we really be trying to outsmart Chat-GPT? I don't think this is sustainable, but it was a very interesting project, and I hope if anybody is using MCQ, I hope you'll continue to use it and maybe send me an email. I'd really like to see how others are doing this. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chahna, for also for keeping time and preventing some of the question and answering them already. So I would suggest that without further ado, we can move to our second speaker, and I invite Margaret to give a presentation.
Hello, thanks so much. Very interesting to hear. It's sort of the world of multiple choice in this new landscape is, I mean, even with the pandemic, there were challenges. So it's very interesting to hear the sorts of adjustments, and I also really note that some of this also revolves around the number of lecturers to student. The ratio there was very high for that second subject. So, but thank you so much, Chahna. I'm talking about is authentic assessment preparing students for a digital world. So a very different sort of change of space, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies and waterways in which Deakin students and teachers come together. And as we learn and teach through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country, Eastern Ma country and Wurundjeri country, as well as the traditional custodians of all the lands on which you may be learning and teaching, where education has taken place for many thousands of years. My co-conspirators, a different kind of acknowledgement, Juuuson Nieminen from the University of Hong Kong and Rola, Ajjawi. I'd like to acknowledge them. So I'm going to start off by saying what I mean by digital or AI-enabled world. I'm going to talk to this fairly rapidly, but I think it's important. So our core argument is that digital technologies, often powered with data and artificial intelligence, have become entangled and constitutive of everyday life. That is to say, we cannot escape it. And thus, the digital has become both a technology, something we use, and also a social practice. And so we use the term digital deliberately in this work to reflect this double status, because it's actually quite a confusing moment. Sometimes we talk about technology just you know, in those tools, a tool of technology, the laptop I use, and sometimes we also talk about it in the ways that it mediates much more complex social interaction. And AI is a key part of the digital. Artificial intelligence is a contentious term, and it's a very debated term. And so even with the rise of generative AI, you'll see a lot of, you know, overselling perhaps of, you know, is AI taking over humanity? Well, not in its current form, I wouldn't have said. But that's partly also because what AI is quite contentious. So just on a side note, we propose that an AI interaction is contextual. So this means that it's about a particular use and between a human in a point in time. And this means that AI interactions form much of what we already do in a digital world. The results of Google Scholar could be considered a form of an AI interaction. The output of DALL-E and some Chat-GPT outputs, but not others. It depends what they are. Sometimes there'll be artificial intelligence, there'll be things I don't know, I'll have to rely on it. Sometimes there won't be. If I type in, who is Professor Margaret Bearman, I come up with a bio that I've mostly written out of Chat-GPT, thanks. I wouldn't say that was artificially intelligent. And I think that we can see from Chahna's talk how much this sort of collision between the digital mediation, the tools that we put forward, these online multiple choice questions, and the digital world in which our students live start to collide. Now, historically, computerization forces a shift from routine, manual and cognitive tasks towards non-routine analytic and interactive tasks. And there's no reason to think that AI won't promote these further shifts. And that means that they have huge implication for the work that people do for professional workforces, and therefore backwards on higher education. And this is where we come to the notion of authentic assessment in a digital world. Now, a common understanding of authentic assessment, here's a definition by Gullikers. Authentic assessment aims to develop the same competencies, combinations of knowledge, skills, and attitudes that students need to apply in the criterion situation in professional life. And that is this idea that authentic assessment somewhere or other mirrors the future world of professional practice. When I say future world, not you know, 2050, I just mean our students' future world of professional practice, what they'll graduate into. And so we make the argument that any authentic engagement should make reference to the digital as part of professional workplaces and as part of global citizenship. But little attention has been paid to the digital and authentic assessment. And if we look at these very common frameworks, they don't mention the digital at all. So we put together this framework, which is about designing the digital into assessment. And we looked at the purposes that people described in the literature that we knew of, and we put them into these three categories. The first purpose is to use the digital as a tool. And this is the most common. When we talk about e-assessment, it's a digital tool. And we wanted to go a little bit further than that and start to unpack, if you're going to pick up the digital as a tool, what might you want to think about? Well, assessment rationales. These are things that we know a lot about, but yet we often forget to mention when we talk about digital assessment. These are things like, are you using it to promote learning or assure learning? How about sustain learning? Very different reasons for using assessment, and often not talked about in relation to e-assessment generally. We want to talk about level of digital enhancement, the SAMA framework, well known. You know, are we enhancing what is already done, or are we transforming it? What is the digital adding to the assessment? And finally, potential harms. And this comes to the notion that digital tools aren't neutral. They can enhance and they can also detract. The second purpose is around digital literacies. And here we move away from the idea that digital is a tool and move to that social idea. When we design the digital into assessment, shouldn't we be thinking about digital literacies? And when we think about digital literacies, should we be thinking about the skills it needs? But what about their ability to critique, to critically appraise the role of the digital in their workplace or their lives? And the third purpose, which is also social purpose, and this is really coming to the fore in the Chat-GPT conversation, and certainly I've written about this before, is human capabilities. What do people need to work in a digital world? What is going to be the human contribution when we're dealing with artificial intelligence, for example? And this is often framed in sort of 21st century skills terms, you know, teamwork, creativity, and so forth. But what do our students need to be able to do as people to do their future work, or even to think about their future self? And by future self, we're really talking about identity work here. How should they be able to see themselves in this digital world? So these are the three purposes when we talk about designing the digital into assessment, and we brought this to bear in authentic assessment as well too. And I'm talking to the chat here. We don't know what AI will be capable of, but we know what this version of AI will be capable of. And I think we have a fairly good idea of how limited this current version is. There may be other stuff, there always is. But I think this round, I think we've got a handle on. How has a digital been designed into authentic assessment is a question we have. And we analysed 55 studies. We pulled them out from using a systematic process, and we didn't assess them as research articles. We looked at the assessment designs. So we analysed studies that specifically called themselves authentic assessment. We didn't interrogate what that was meant by that. If they called themselves authentic, it was enough, and that the role of technology needed to be central to the assessment. And then we analysed those designs. And what did we find? We used our framework. First of all, most authentic assessment engages with the digital around digital tools. And most of those, 27 out of the 55, were around credentialing or assuring learning. And this could be things like, you know, an online proctoring system. It could be a very basic sort of exam administration system. These are all fitting under the role of being authentic. We saw some really nice examples. For example, e-portfolios as a way to transform pen and paper assessment. We saw quite a lot of this. And this is a transformational thing. You can't do it in pen and paper. It's difficult to put in video in that sort of way, for example. It comes to the idea of sustaining student learning in the sense that these students could take this skill that they learned and take it into their workplace. You saw this with teacher portfolios, for example. You could take this portfolio you put together as part of your teaching degree and into your workplace. So some really nice examples here. I do have to say, we're highlighting the nice examples, but a lot of this, I mean, a lot of the examples were perhaps a little less than exciting, shall we say. Over half studies talked about developing credentialing digital literacies in some way. But again, while there were some great examples, a lot of the time, people just kind of expected that this digital literacy would be built by use. So they might say, in doing this authentic task, students will learn how to use Google Drive and Dropbox, and that will provide them with digital literacies. It wasn't built in as learning outcomes, and it didn't appear to be scaffolded with teaching. And we see that as a gap. This wasn't true for all papers. You can get a sense from looking at the slide here. And there was no evaluation or critique. This is also a problem. So I think it's a gap. And particularly again with Chat-GPT, we really see the need for this gap. But even with Google Drive and Dropbox, you know, who's owning my data? Where's it going to? And, you know, if you're just doing the osmotic model, you don't really come to grips with these bigger ideas. The third purpose was developing credentialing human capabilities for a digital world. And there were 8 studies. And these focused on developing human characteristics, specifically machines could not succeed with, and they were often integrated with other things. So there's a lovely public magazine task and media studies, and this was really about building collaboration and group work. They used the digital space to do it, but the idea was that this was a characteristic that they needed to do, collaboration, and that this was something that was needed in their digital world. And yes, they used digital tools as well too. These papers moved across purposes. Another example, and I'm galloping through here because I am a little mindful of time. This is about a more complex one about developing identities. So video narratives in physical education to try and allow students to express their emotions and vulnerabilities within a digital world. A really nice example of building the human within authentic assessment to live in a digital world. And then finally, we identified another purpose that we hadn't seen in our original framework, and this was communality. Collaboration we talked about before, but this was more than collaboration. This was collaboration into the community. It's a great task, a statistics task. The digital wasn't big here, it was Excel, but the students worked with disability organisations. They analysed this data to enhance the life of the communities. And this was work conducted closely with the community, not for them. So it was together. It was really lovely. The chat is going off about AI, so I'm going to finish here, but I really want to address that question, and I've left myself some time to do that in this slide as well too. So this is a framework that we came to, the 4 purposes, and this is really the close of the talk. But I think we want to bring it back to AI because everyone is talking about it so much. Closer attention is needed for the digital, including Gen AI and authentic assessment design. Our review offers analytical tools for this. We need to move beyond digital task design. We need to set learning outcomes around the digital. It's not going to happen osmotically. And authentic assessment needs to meaningfully engage with all 4 purposes, and particularly excited by this notion of communality. To pay attention to the digital and the authentic and their overlay. Now, I'm going to just briefly address generative AI just because the chat is going off and I hold the floor. And at this point, I can wield my first class honours degree in computer science, which I don't do very often because it's a really long time ago. Generative AI is fundamentally restricted to the corpus from which it comes. It statistically analyses data. So it can generate a lot of things, but it does so based on that data. And that really restricts what it can and cannot do. It is like outstanding, nuanced, clever, predictive text. But it is not sentient, it can't reason, and this is why it is so different. And the other thing I want to raise about the first class honours degree, and I think I said this before in other fora, so forgive me if you've heard it before. I finished my degree in computer science a long time ago. I'm not going to tell you when because it's a very long time ago. And when I returned and I left beside, you know, we were learning about AI, at that time. I left it. I went into education. I didn't really engage much with algorithms for a couple of years, possibly decades. And then I returned back, and what I saw was the algorithms were the same. The algorithms haven't changed. People are saying generative AI can create speech, music, video, etc. Yes, it does so based on a corpus. So that is different. It's different to, it is similar to what we do, but we have a broader corpus than generative AI do. And this is the thought of the day that I'll leave you with. I went to a big festival called the Festival of AI with AI researchers, people who really have been working in AI for a really long time, who who were programming large language models, these kind of things. And I think there was a general consensus that it's actually not the large language model that's the issue. It's the data. So if we're talking about designing the digital into authentic assessment, and I'm going to come back to here for the moment, we need to alert our students to data. Data is going to be the key. What data? Who holds the data? Restricting data. If we prevent our text from moving into a data field, suddenly it's not going to be part of that large language model. So data is going to be, I think, the battleground on which many things are run, and I think we'll see some very interesting things here. Could be wrong about that, because one thing we don't know is how the society is going to move with Gen AI, and that's what will give it the power. And just some citations for you while I'm ranting away at you about generative AI and not allowing you to ask questions. Here are some citations about that piece of work. And in this piece of work here, we define artificial intelligence. And in the work that we cite in here, we come into some of the well understood restrictions around artificial intelligence and what we mean by AI. So that is, and now we're still talking about the data in the warehouse of Google, Facebook and the likes. Yes, we live in scary times. All the more reason to build critical digital literacies into authentic assessment. I'll stop talking now, having had my AI rant, and I'll hand back over to Q&A. Oh, someone said rant away. Oh my God, don't get, just let me go. I could talk about Chat-GPT for a very long time.
But this is what we enjoy, having a nice debate, which is very productive. And I want to thank both speakers for being bang on time, and also for moderating themselves, which makes my job really simple. But I just want to invite, of course, colleagues to add questions in the chat, and by all means, James as well, who was helping me out today, filtering questions. Please feel free to chip in and let us know if there is something that I'm missing in the chat as well. I think, Chahna, there was a comment. I think you went addressing the questions about inclusivity,
yes,
and accessibility. But I think there was also a comment about from Alice, and this was related to the structuring of the MCQ and the fact that perhaps not single MCQ displays the same weight as the other.
oh yeah.
I don't know whether you wanted to address that point.
Yeah, okay. So in these tests, all of the questions, I guess you could say they didn't necessarily have the same weight. So for example, the later questions where we use scenarios and branching, because those questions had multiple sections, they were weighted more heavily. But they also, when I mapped those questions, they also elicited different skills in each part. So I think it was also fair to weight them differently for that reason. I think in terms of how we distribute the weighting of questions, but also the timing of questions, which did come up previously, I think this is really a matter of judgment. I think overall, my opinion is that in a test, you can have sections that are worth a greater amount. Maybe they require more time and they are more deliberative in terms of how you work through them. I would agree that that is a good approach, and that's what I've been putting into practice, but I don't think there are any hard and fast rules against this. I think if you're using MCQ for more formative purposes, maybe you can just stick to kind of questions that are weighted the same if that's suitable for the goal of that formative assessment. But certainly in summative assessment, I think this variety is a very key point. And for me, it was quite important to have students working through different sections of the test that were more difficult than others in terms of timing and weighting and the skills that they would require.
Absolutely.
Fabio, I did also spot one other question. Sorry that I didn't answer.
Please help yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So there was a question from Lai. She said, "Oh, sorry, I'm assuming here. I probably didn't get it fully right, but does the speaker use ChatGPT to test the questions?" Yes, I wrote the questions in draft and then tested each one by one in ChatGPT. Now, at the time, I was only using ChatGPT 3 because 4 wasn't out yet. And my assumption was that because it was free, it was democratized, students might gravitate towards it. So I did this on the assumption that if they were going to be using ChatGPT, let me see how it works in GPT 3 or 3.5 as it was at the time, to see what the free version would turn out in terms of responses. So for each question I put in the draft, I adapted the questions accordingly, and then I kept a spreadsheet where I mapped them against the different Bloom skills. So I was trying to ensure that regardless of the changes that I made in terms of the iterations of the questions, that they were still testing the skills that I wanted, because I could see that, like, maybe inflation is not the word, but I can see that you could easily move towards everything being too difficult if ChatGPT is able to answer all of these questions. So I thought it was quite important to keep that overview as well.
Thanks.
And then, sorry, Fabio, just one more question from Mike I saw. Is that okay for me to go for it, Fabio?
Sure, very quickly, please.
Very quickly. Okay, so that one was the fact that ChatGPT can now read images. Yes, it can. I assume that not all students are going to pay for GPT-4 immediately. I'm sure at some point they will. Maybe it will become cheaper. And as a result, I created my own very simple versions of some of those frameworks that we'd use in PowerPoint. It wasn't able to respond correctly to my original images, and I'm not sure how long that will last for, but certainly excluding some of the text from the frameworks that we usually see in textbooks is one workaround for that.
Thanks a lot for this. No, it's of course very interesting. Margaret, there is a lot going on related to your presentation as well. So I'm more than happy for you to actually pick what you think is important to address. But from me, I guess a question would be, I mean, obviously you were emphasizing the importance of developing critical thinking, and I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about how we can do it in practice in the face of ChatGPT.
Absolutely, and the complete shameless plug I have put in here is this recent publication. I'll post it again. This comes to the idea of critical digital literacies, particularly around AI, which I think seems to be, according to the chat, at any rate, the topic of the moment. But as I said, I think there are other things other than AI. Data is another really big one, and all forms of quantification, which is essentially what underpins most forms of the digital, come with some caveats, I think, some outstanding capabilities, but some caveats. So critical digital literacies, I think that one of the big things that I think that we should be doing is revealing the critical critical digital literacies that we have ourselves. I mean, Fabio, you mentioned you like intellectual streaking a while ago. I think we need to intellectually streak about our, by which I mean, you know, show the uncertainties in our mind, is to describe some of the challenges that we face in this world. Like, let me give you a really simple digital example, which I think is from this paper that I don't know about you, but I deal with as an academic every day. I am judged by the number of papers I write, how they are cited, what those metrics are. A lot of the time Google Scholar is used. Now that's something that I use it all the time myself, but it does have a certain algorithmic process behind it. So I think we can reveal our own challenges. You know, we're setting these things, we're setting our assessments. We draw on Chat-GPT. How do we struggle with, and what are the things that we need to know when we use those technologies or we think about them out in the professional workplace? I think that the thing about, for me, one of the most important things about AI, and I will agree with Mark a little bit here. One way in which I think it is human is it is not, you can't trust it in the way that you trusted. That's a black box thing. You can't trust it in the way you used to trust technology. If I put something to Excel, I can trust how it will come out. There's a lot more doubt in here. So I think we need to start thinking in terms of doubts and trust and these really complex, nuanced, not black and white questions. There's another question in the chat here. How should we best tool up us teachers? How can we abduct them? Yeah, look, I reckon that's a fabulous question, James. And I think part of the issue is that it's very difficult when we've never experienced authentic assessments in ourselves. And I do wonder if and the other thing I'm really bearing in mind, the previous speaker, Chahna, who really, you know, you have to mark all this stuff. Well, one of the work that I did with Phil Dawson many years ago of assessment design really said, look, design also takes place under these tremendous constraints. And one of the big constraints in higher education at the moment is how much we're asked to do with very little. And I think that one of the big things that I think we should be thinking about is taking some of the heat off, and I think I put this in the chat, the effort we put into assurance. We spend a lot of time and money paying to credential students to assure things. If we did that less frequently, but every student still has to do it, and spent more time on learning focused, authentic tasks, I think it might be a more playful and enjoyable experience for lecturers, and then really just resourced very heavily these more high stakes moments. It's a very different model of assessment, and I think we may have to move to it. Yeah, a little bit about programmatic assessment. Programmatic assessment itself is tricky. And agree with Mathew. Yeah, there are tensions, but that's what makes it so interesting. I've come to time, so I'll hand back to you, Fabio.
Most certainly 1 hour is not enough to put the world right, but we try always our best, and I think we managed to provide some good suggestions and spark some reflections. So I would thank the two presenters from the bottom of my heart for giving an excellent presentation, perfectly timed, answering questions, and making our job so easy. And I really hope the audience enjoyed this. I would hand it over to Mathew for the final goodbyes and information. And thanks a lot to everybody for being with us this morning for us, or afternoon for people in Australia and on the other side of the planet.
Thanks, Fabio. Thanks, Chahna. Thanks, Margaret. A fantastic session. And as Fabio says, I think this could have gone on for another hour. The recording will be on our website, hopefully by tomorrow. And just as a reminder, the next session coming up on the 5th of July will be a winners showcase from the e-assessment awards, which are actually happening yesterday and today in London. So join us again next month. Thanks very much, folks. See you around the traps.